Welcome to another episode of This Ain't No Picnic. We're coming at you recording from the no man's land of Richmond. D Slough, which is Richmond, Tawasin, Ladner, no man's land, lower mainland, British Columbia, Canada.
Downwind from the tunnel.
45 minutes south from Vancouver and 45 minutes north of the American Washington state border.
That's where we are.
That's where we are.
We're here right now in a world where we might end up with a green conservative coalition.
Yes, this has been floating around, at least hypothetically, in the air after an article that quoted Elizabeth May as stating that she could see herself forming a coalition government with any of the parties, no matter what their stripe, no matter what their ideological orientation.
And it's funny that when we were doing that NDP Greens comparison, we're like, okay, well, we started saying stuff like that, and we're like, well, maybe we shouldn't go that far. Like that's maybe we're just playing into fancy a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And that speaks to us, like, trying to not get too far into the conspiratorial conjecture game, right?
Yeah.
It's like we're trying to, see it based off the facts, off the evidence.
But now she's come on TV and said, well, hypothetically, I think it can work because we can work with everybody as long as they, like, of course, the chances of them coming to a deal about the carbon pricing and stuff, it's like a bit unlikely.
Unlikely. But the fact that she's willing to entertain that possibility.
It's like with all of the other outside of the environment, with all the other policy positions of the Conservative Party, the fact that she can even think, maybe I can make it work with them. It's like it's astounding to me. I can't believe I was very surprised.
Yeah. Part of me was very surprised, and I guess the only thing that makes that where I felt like I was less surprised was, and of course,
that we called it.
Is that I called it? There's this too. And then, when she was, the fact that she came on, although she came on board into Parliament during the Brian Mulroney Progressive Conservative era. Now, that shouldn't be any, cause for making that kind of connection, because she was in it purely from a kind of, climate policy advising position. But another thing that gave me away is that, she seems to have, when she was doing an interview with Maclean's magazine with Paul Wells, I think it was about a month ago, she was talking about how Paul Wells had asked her a question, like, how are you going to pay for some of these policies? Or, what are some of your economic policies? It almost seems as if, Greens are historically always just a one-issue kind of party. And she kind of, smiled at the camera and said, I have similar policies. I have similar kinds of economic aspirations as Preston Manning from the Reform Party of Canada, which is fiscal responsibility, which is another way of saying austerity. Yeah, and the Reform Party, which had formed in 1987 and then disbanded around the Unite the Right movement in the early 2000s, when it became rebranded as the Conservative Party of Canada. The first prime minister of which was Stephen Harper. The Reform Party had been a party that was quite brutal with their austerity aspirations. So there's that.
Yeah, and this all kind of brings us to the conversation we're going to have.
Something to look out for. This is just our intro to say that, if you were thinking, if you are on the left and you're kind of going through deliberations or you're equivocating about who to vote for this 2019 election, if you were thinking Green, think again.
Think again.
Think again. Really do think again.
Really do.
Yeah.
All Seb Gorka impressions aside.
Yeah.
So, and it brings us to our topic today, which is we're talking about the Waffle Movement, and seeing as it now seems that there really is only one choice for the left in this field, we're discussing the NDP, and it's using the Waffle Movement as the sort of main focus, but overall its reaction to grassroots sort of radical aspects of their party and the way that the NDP has reacted to them over history and what that means going forward from a left perspective and how to be effectively using our political action.
Yeah. So the Waffle Movement sprang as a party within the NDP, and they germinated around 1968, 1969. But to back up a little bit, just to give some context with the NDP were formerly the CCF, which was the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. They were a party that sprang out of and was reaction to the Great Depression. They were formed in 1932 in Calgary, and their policies sprang from the dire socioeconomic circumstances around there. Most of the people who had formed the party were, farmers, people in different like cooperatives, whether it was like labor intensive or agrarian, and socialists they also welcomed as well. But from the beginning, it wasn't a radical left kind of party in any way, shape, or form. They did call for a mixed economy. They were for nationalization, but it wasn't anything Marxist
Not
or
in like
communist.
not in the sense of
any
like
way,
seizing means of production or
Yeah.
anything like that. It was more of like I guess like what would be currently described as a social democratic
Yeah.
party, with an emphasis on labor.
Yeah. And the NDP formed in 1961 when the CCF had formed with the Canadian Labour Council. And from the beginning, they were sort of a social democratic party with Keynesian measures that they would have liked to implement. They weren't for full-scale nationalization, but like the CCF, some nationalization, but again, a mixed economy with some private influence going into it. So, and from the beginning, it was Tommy Douglas, who was the first federal leader of the party, who was the leader who brought Canada its single-payer universal Medicare healthcare.
Yeah. So, and as far as their positions on nationalization and stuff, in 1965 they passed a resolution on foreign ownership, and also later in 1967 they doubled down on a resolution about economic independence of Canada, in the sense of not as far as the later Waffle would go, as far as American imperialism or anything like that, but just a certain they had a stance about a certain amount of protection for Canadian savings and making sure that some of the wealth generated in Canada stayed in Canada, even if there was some level of foreign ownership. So like they were definitely there's a reason why the Waffle sprang up in this party as opposed to obviously the Liberals or the Conservatives.
Yeah. Yeah, it was our official social democratic party. The other parties were, like from the beginning, like quite establishment. So the Waffle forms in 1968, 1969, and some background information to that. Of course, it's like right smack dab in the middle of the student movements, the counterculture, the civil rights movement, second wave feminism, anti-Vietnam War, anti-imperialism.
Also, the Quebec separatist movement was gaining a lot of steam at that time, so very central to like Canadian politics. And part of the problems that the Waffle wanted to discuss is that like the Americanization of our social movements, in the sense that like we have our own problems, but like anti-imperialism is an important issue, but not from the stance of Canada. Like in the Vietnam War, they of course have anti-war stances and everything like that, but to equate Canada's problems with the specific problems in the United States, especially when it comes to certain race issues and stuff, that it wasn't that it was distracting from the real problems we were facing in Canada ourselves.
Yeah, so not just like American fiscal multinational corporate kind of control, but also kind of cultural hegemonic control, even with our own student movements and everything.
So in 68, 69, James Laxer and 5 other students got together to write this manifesto. The first draft of it, at least, and those students were Krista Motes, John and Pat Smart, and Lauren and Carolyn Brown. They are known as a Kingston group generally, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Later, they were joined by the likes of Mel Watkins and also Ed Broadbent, who eventually became the leader of the NDP later. But he ended up leaving the group after the third draft was written because he didn't want to. He was unable to water down the more socialist, more nationalistic rhetoric of the Waffle Movement, which he was trying to subdue a little bit from his point of view. And it's actually from him, his criticism of the movement, the manifesto, that the name Waffle came from, because in a response to him trying to water down those measures, one of the other writers of the manifesto said, if we're going to waffle, I'd rather waffle to the left than to the right. And that's where the name Waffle Movement came from.
So yeah, let's go through. Let's maybe talk a bit about briefly what is in the actual manifesto itself.
Yeah.
After we go through the whole trajectory of the waffle movement in the late 60s, early 70s, then we are going to more comprehensively analyze and criticize what the legacy of the waffles were, their manifesto going into actual reality. So right from the get-go, they were. The heading for the manifesto was a movement for an independent socialist Canada.
Yeah.
So it was a nationalist socialist project that called for nationalization of the heights, in the language of the actual manifesto, the heights of the Canadian economy.
Yeah.
It's a reaction to American fiscal imperialist multinational corporation to takeover of our industries, especially our resource extraction industries, but other parts as well.
Yeah,
automotive, for example.
Yeah. And it's also in response to that American imperialism, they're saying that even if we favored Canadian capitalists over American capitalists and had that Canadian independence and Canadian socialism are intrinsically linked, and if they were trying to have any kind of real independence from America, it would have to be socialist independence. And that's where their stance on Quebec comes from, is that they realize that if they accept the two nations, one struggle sort of idea, that they have an ally in Quebec if Anglo-Canada and French Canada would work together against American imperialism, that would be a way in which that they would be more likely to have a challenge, because Quebec has despite what a lot of Anglo-Canadians want to think, they have a very distinct, very protected culture that really they do match all the criteria of
Oh, for sure. It's completely different. We used to live in Montreal, right, Brad? I mean, it was completely different there. So it's self-determination for Quebec. Now, for Quebec to have self-determination, of course, that's up for themselves. It was up to themselves to decide what self-determination would look like. But a lot of establishment NDPers and just the Canadian population, especially English Canadian population in general, were a little bit worried and critical of what this self-determination would look like. Does this mean secession from the actual Confederation? What is this? But of course, it being self-determination, it is up for them. It would have been and is up for them to be able, under the Waffle framework, to decide what that would actually look like.
Yeah.
Right? So.
And then, very importantly, one thing that the Waffle Manifesto included that hasn't really been discussed popularly within Canada since then is democratization of the workplace, let alone democratization of all of our institutions. So when they're talking about democratization of the workplace, it means giving some measure of control to labor to define the restrictions of the place that they spend most of their time in, so that they're not going to living in a democracy but going to work in an autocracy every single day.
Yeah, exactly.
And from social movements that have happened in Canada since then, that's really hasn't been a center focus by any means, and so that is something that sets them apart.
Yeah, they wanted to go beyond just welfare state Keynesian measures, which typified sort of the West from the post-World War II period up until the advent of neoliberalism, really in the mid to late 70s, and couched in more radical, some would argue, a little bit intellectualized language, or if not intellectualized, more Marxist parlance, so things like complete de-commodification, and of plenty of aspects of life. And then there's this one real humdinger that they have, which is I've got it right here. It's this one phrase that just seems very prototypical of the late 60s, 70s, which is equal opportunity for creative, non-exploitative self-development, which is something, in actuality, would be a great thing for everyone to have, but just the turn of phrase itself seems very typical of that period. But anyway, so
The other thing that the manifesto really called for, and this probably is part of the reason that like there's a certain amount of resistance seen right off the bat, is that they are calling for a radicalization of the NDP and to like change it from just a electoral parliamentary group to the sort of parliamentary wing of a movement, and like that there. It does say within the manifesto, it says that the NDP needs to be radicalized from the inside and from without. So it's there is like definitely a pretty strong push towards radicalization and socialism within the rhetoric, and you could argue that certain sections of this manifesto are pretty redundant and repeat themselves without getting into that many specifics. So like where they had different bullet points that basically were the same as the one before, they didn't really take the time to flesh out those ideas in a very concrete way, at least in the manifesto document.
Yeah, and it's got, your kind of typical call to arms tone to the manifesto that, like anyone that hears the word manifesto, the association comes to it, that kind of call to arms bravado. But, to their credit, manifesto aside, they're the farthest that any radical left faction ever got to actually making an influence within, the parliamentary system within Canada. So that is important to know. That's of important note.
Yeah. So when they entered the conference in Winnipeg, the first one, they managed to gain because there wasn't so much resistance from the party at that point in time, because they didn't really expect them to have such a dramatic turnout, and for them to really be able to do all the things that they were eventually able to do. So like they like ended up getting some panel discussions put forward where like, because the way it works is that they would have like different panel discussions and then vote on that idea to then later go to the committee. And so they won on a couple of things like education for post-secondary education to be at least paid for to a certain extent. This was later the thing is a lot of their victories in this first conference ended up being reneged on a little bit. Like when this
was the most open that the NDP party establishment was to them, even though there was still some resistance. They at least lended an open ear towards their proposals.
Absolutely. And so they did end up winning an expansion of like public ownership as a policy. Obviously, none of these policies got enacted because NDP never came to power at that point. But just in the sense that they were able to influence the party in these panel discussions for things like withdrawal from NATO, for post-secondary education, for public ownership, and even though it was later changed, the language was later changed. They even got them to call out Canada for becoming a resource-based and consumer market to the American empire. So like they came into this convention with a lot of energy and without that much pushback, because they weren't very well known at that point. So.
And then the NDP establishment, they came up with their own manifesto, which they termed the Marshmallow Manifesto, which is in response to the Waffles, of course, because right from the get-go, another thing that a part of their manifesto was for Canadians to form their own trade unions and not be affiliated with the American-based internationalist trade unions. And right from the get-go, the heads of the Canadian trade unions who were affiliated with the internationalists,
like the UAW and
UAW, auto workers, steel workers, all of these different unions, their leaders especially, who were being paid by the internationalist local bases, did not want anything like this to happen, because it meant screwing up with what the system was that had been set up under that. It would call for a complete wiping the slate clean of what that system was, and for putting something up that was different. So right from the beginning, there was some backlash from the Canadian trade unions.
Yeah. And when 8 Waffle supporters became council members at the end of the convention, the unions weren't happy about that either. And one of the founding members, Mel Watkins, became one of 8 vice presidents, because there were 8 vice presidents in the council, and he became one of the 8 vice presidents. And he had been involved in the earlier NDP foreign ownership stuff that we mentioned before. he had been involved in that legislation and came to the Waffle after being a part of that. So he's going to be a central figure and would have later ran for leadership maybe, but he would become too old and sick, and he's definitely
Yeah.
one of the older members of the Waffle for sure.
Yeah, and around that time too, I think it was about like came out through that report, but it was like at least half of Canadians felt like it was a problem that American multinational corporations exerted that much influence in our economy. So I think it was at that time something like that had actual like substantial opposition.
Yeah.
That fact. So after the convention in Winnipeg, the Waffles had some confidence, and they were able to organize a lot more. They were able to open up a sort of like federal council as well as provincial councils, all of which they published their own newsletter. They were able to organize it in such a way that there was gender parity on all their council boards. And they were gearing up to be able to exert more influence from within the party, especially in a parliamentary fashion.
Yes, and also in 1970, because the NDP was still in a sort of like conciliatory mood with them, and they didn't see them as much of a existential threat or a party within the party, which was later the term to describe them. They allowed them to start a bit of a sort of like extra parliamentary project in Kitchener. So like this was one of apparently the central goals of the Waffle Movement, which it seemed never really became actualized, and which is one of the major criticisms of them, especially from the left, is that they weren't able to set up a extra parliamentary sort of citizen activist education system where people could be taught about the ideas of socialism and all these things, which is supposedly what they wanted the NDP to become, as the parliamentary wing of this movement, but they never really built up that grassroots infrastructure for bringing new people and pushing and attaching the party to movements. But they did start a pilot program in Kitchener, which ended up being involved in the Dunlop closure in 1970. And at this point, this is sort of like one of the failures of the Waffle Movement, as well, as that when they approached the factory workers felt like they sort of took over the protest, as opposed to like listening to labor and working with them, that they were too busy trying to run the protests and run the narrative, and so that they actually ended up having a bit of strife with the labor unions there, and that in the end the Waffle was critical of both the MPP, Jim Renwick, for his pushing the contest into litigation as opposed to any sort of like labor militancy. So like, despite their like best intentions, some of their forms of activism became somewhat condescending and also kind of inhibitory to actual progress as well at this time. Like, they were seen to be, while trying their best to create an atmosphere of something, they weren't necessarily meeting what was in front of them.
Yeah, it's sort of the clash between intelligentsia and and proletariat, between like sort of mental labor and physical labor, and a little bit of the cult of personality that goes sometimes with some of these movements. Post drafting a manifesto. In 1970, the Ontario NDP elect Stephen Lewis to be their leader provincially, and he would play a part later on in the Waffle saga in terms of purging them from the actual provincial party. But in the meantime, before that happened, it's just important to note that he was elected the provincial leader because he is a major NDP personality, part of this sort of NDP, this CCF NDP dynasty going back to David Lewis, and then Stephen Lewis, and then Stephen Lewis's son, Ari Lewis, is in fact.
Avi Lewis.
Avi Lewis was the one that drafted together with his wife, Naomi Klein, the LEAP manifesto in 2015, 2016.
It's also important to note that he won by somewhat pandering to the radical rhetoric, and he did sway some of the Waffle voters against his opponent, who was more of a centrist. What was his name? Pittman was his last name. Anyway, so he beat Pittman, who was more of a centrist, moderate reformer, by playing to sort of like the radical attitudes that existed within the party. But that was his rhetoric, but his actions, he was tying himself to the labor unions and getting support from them, which will like definitely come into play later in his later actions. So.
Yeah. So in 1971, Tommy Douglas steps down as federal leader of the NDP. He'd been the leader for 10 years. And so there was a leadership race in which there was a Waffle candidate who was running for that position, and that was Jim Laxer. So he was running against David Lewis, so Stephen Lewis's father, who'd been a personality since the days of CCF, as well as Ed Broadbent was in the leadership race, and two others whose names I can't remember at this time.
They're not as important.
But they're not as important compared to...
It was Howard and Harney. Howard was the furthest right, and Harney was another sort of like mealy-mouthed centrist, like Ed Broadbent or Pittman.
Yeah.
So... But really, what ended up happening is that Lewis, who is like the establishment candidate from the NDP, he's been part of the like lifeblood for a decade against this young upstart socialist Laxer. So nobody really expected Jim Laxer to take it to the fourth round of elections, I guess, within the party for not. And the thing is that even Jim Laxer only thought he was going to make 15% of the 15 to 20% of the vote, and ended up with a 37%.
Yeah, and I guess he was buoyed forward by like on the previous ballots, like the other people voting for those candidates, and once those candidates, whether it was Ed Broadbent or the other candidates, once they were like taken off the ballot, they kind of were choosing. Some of them had bad blood towards David Lewis's sort of like establishment connections, and then so went to Jim Laxer. Yeah. But towards the end, I mean, there was an overwhelming support for David Lewis because he was the established candidate. He had the trade, especially he had the trade unions backing him.
He had the unions, which like the Waffle sort of made some missteps in sort of attacking the union leadership in a way that made it even the rank and file feel that they were anti-labor when they weren't necessarily anti-labor. It's just that they were against international unions, which the UAW and the steelworkers both were, and they were against the sort of bureaucratic power of the unions and the fact that they felt that a lot of the resistance coming from the labor administration was because the labor administration would end up losing power if the Waffle would come in, even if labor as a whole would benefit from the Waffle policies. It was perceived that they were making it so that the NDP was unelectable as well. So like the perception of the labor administration, like the union brass, basically was that they were afraid of the Waffle coming in because they wanted to be elected to power, and they didn't see that being possible with the Waffle.
Yeah, and so after the leadership race, in which Jim Laxer came on the fourth ballot, so he came second to David Lewis, the Waffle themselves, especially the founding personalities, felt pretty confident in moving forward and being able to continue to exert influence from within the NDP, so in a parliamentary fashion. But there was some criticisms from the other members that were a part of the Waffle. So some of which were, more along the lines of like Marxist communist sympathizers or people who had those, and then Trotskyists who believed that, that they were spending too much time trying to exert influence through the official channels of the parliamentary process within the NDP. So there was that side of it. And then another side of it was that they thought that they stopped at state capitalism, that at the end of the day they were calling for nationalization, but for some of them who were more radically left, they didn't feel like there was enough of there wasn't mention or there wasn't any steps taken to be able to suggest to those involved that they could be involved with, say, like, the full expropriation of the means of production, So the Trotskyists themselves, a lot of them left, and they formed another party, which was called the Red Circle.
Yeah. And they were led by Steve Penner, who was a waffler from very early on. So it's not like it was a split from within the waffle for sure.
And I think it was Mel Watkins who had suggested that only NDP members could be members of the waffle and could vote on waffle motions going forward. So even from the higher up, they were trying to consolidate their own vision of what the waffle should be about, which was more along the lines of parliamentary tactics.
Yeah.
Which ended up not really working in their favor, considering all we've said in terms of the disjunction between them and rank and file trade unions. They came across as too academic, too intellectual, and that sort of gave the trade union leaders ammo in painting the waffle as being exactly that, too scholastic.
And not that there wasn't some we're kind of giving the waffle most of the blame, which they definitely share some of it. But when it comes to the unionists, there was at that last convention, there was blackmail. There were threats made against people. Some people wearing waffle pins were thrown against the wall and made to take them off, and so that it wasn't it was quite contentious. This whole thing, it was it wasn't like the labor acted as a monolith completely. They definitely were supporters of waffle and labor and stuff. It's just that the union brass definitely was not for the waffles approach, basically.
So the death knell for the waffle really occurred in 1972. Stephen Lewis, who we talked about previously, the son of David Lewis, who then became the federal leader of the NDP. Stephen Lewis was the leader of the provincial Ontario NDP. At first, he was a little bit, it seemed as if he was open to some of the waffles' claims and concerns, their opinion. But coming into 1972, the Ontario trade unions felt as if they could no longer deal with the waffle exerting any more influence, considering their Canadian union aspirations, excluding the internationalist bent to the actual trade unions. So they met the Ontario NDP in Oshawa to pretty much lay out what they saw as the problem with the waffle movement and how it was steering the NDP away from what they considered to be their true aspirations and what their policy set should be. And so in reaction to that, the waffle came out with a set of resolutions to say, look, it's we're not just trying to be a radical left contingent within the party that is looking to, get in the way of trade union activity or just be involved with strikes or anything like that. It's we have also been trying to employ parliamentary measures. They were also, they were willing to come to a consensus in a lot of ways in the conventions, watering down some of the policies that they'd suggested in the manifesto itself. So they weren't, just so radical to the point that they were unwilling to listen to the establishment itself. In fact, they were keeping the lines of communication open with the party establishment. But Stephen Lewis, as the leader, did have the trade unions who staunchly did not want the waffles to be a part of the NDP.
Yeah, and they were accusing them of basically being a party within the party, and that was the justification with which to oust them from the Ontario NDP, is that they said that they're operating at odds with the party, what the party wants, and that they're dividing the party, they're acting as a dividing energy in the party, and they need to be expunged, basically.
Mm-hmm. And it was interesting though too, because despite the fact that it was overwhelming the trade union support for purging the waffle from the ranks, the actual members themselves of the NDP outside of the trade unions, they had about anywhere between 35 to 40% support. Many of which, when there was a commission that had been established to be able to go around Ontario to see exactly how NDP members what they thought about the waffle themselves. A lot of them didn't want them to be expunged or purged out. In fact, they even if they didn't necessarily support the waffle, they didn't see them as like being so radical that they were gumming up the works of the party itself.
Yeah, and they were acting like that's part of the idea of democracy as well, right?
Yeah.
And like that was the point is that like they're just voicing they're still it's not like they're going into the headquarters and like taking Stephen Lewis by force or something, or like doing some sort of like crazy radical. They're just going to the conventions and trying to sway opinion.
Yeah.
And like so to oust people for that, and then especially when they end up going towards a more like later in history towards a more like centrist or conciliatory position with Ed Broadbent and later Tom Mulcair, and they've done this several times in a row now, and it always leads to them falling short because they start to become a little bit indistinguishable from the Liberals, and the Liberals are able to take their best positions and then make themselves get voted in on that, like with from everything from like healthcare to like now talking about banning plastic straws or pharmacare or any of these things. Like they just get their best ideas poached away from the Liberals, who end up not doing them. But
Yeah. Yeah.
in the case of healthcare, they did.
Yeah, that's the problem with being the third party, and that has been a problem. That, like you said, with like Ed Broadbent, especially in the 1988 election, where the Canada-U.S. Free trade deal, which would later become NAFTA, when that was a huge argumentative point for that election. Ed Broadbent and the party was against free trade, but he didn't seem to really throw his weight into his criticism as much as John Tory's Liberals were able to. They were able to paint themselves as more radically against free trade, and that ended up making them the NDPs in 1988, much like Tom Mulcair in 2015, in 1988. They had 20% support. Tom Mulcair, like leading up to the 2015 election, it was what was called the Orange Wave. So there was much more massive support behind Tom Mulcair. And like with John Tory in 1988, by putting himself, positing the Liberals as being more radically opposed to free trade than the NDP. In 2015, Tom Mulcair said that he would balance the budget within a year of being elected, and then Justin Trudeau was able to say, no, we're going to run a deficit. So he was able to paint himself as more of an anti-austerity potential leader. So that's the problem of being like this like third party, is that it's like you have this more center left, center right party who's able to pick and choose these potential policies to be able to sway voters when you have two other parties on either side of the spectrum.
And I guess that brings us sort of like to the broader conversation about this, like the history of the waffle and all the like details are interesting, but in the end the point about this is that like when it comes to us moving forward about Canadian activism and what we can do within the electoral system, it doesn't seem that like, because the waffle isn't the only example. There's also the NPI, which is the new political initiative, which was around 2001, but pre September 11th, and then now with the LEAP manifesto, which is mainly an environmental project, not seen, and actually, funnily enough, by James Laxer, criticized for not being left enough, even though he definitely has a grudge against Avi Lewis.
Yeah, I would imagine. Yeah, exactly.
But so when it comes to like the criticisms of waffle, I can see that there is, I think, a legitimacy to them being overly academic.
Yeah, for sure.
Not really being able to make that connection, not only with labor within the party, but also when involving themselves to try and make grassroots movements, to not really making that engagement, like for example with the Dunlop factory closure. And I think that inability does come a bit from them dictating their point of view onto the issue without letting there be enough of a feedback from where they're coming from. And then eventually, because they didn't get that feedback the way that they wanted, they focused then on electoral politics, which like is clearly important. But like when you're talking about, like we were saying, a third party problem, that is it then, if you are this third party, that do you try and make yourself more electable and then less distinguishable from the other two parties because they're the two parties that always get elected? Or do you differentiate yourself and become, maybe you don't take full majority power, but then you have a populist power behind you.
Right.
You know, like if they would accept the movements that would generally align themselves, like the Waffle or NPI or even like certain environmental and social movements happening now, which are starting to become non-ideological because they don't have anywhere to like land. And like, even though I disagree with that non-ideological stance, it's just that, like, for example, the LEAP movement, like they want to be accepted by the NDP, but they don't really speak that much about social issues. And then you have, like we were saying at the beginning of this conversation, Elizabeth May saying she might make a coalition with the Conservatives.
Yeah, she wouldn't be adverse to it, right?
Yeah, and it's like that. This like non-ideological stance is not something that is sustainable from a leftist perspective.
Yeah, and to us to like keep that so-called non-ideological stance is in itself an ideology,
Exactly.
because what it is doing is that it's just putting your positioning behind pretty much the established capital kind of model it is right now. So it's like it's this kind of shoe-in position in which that you don't have to think about more partisan issues, which, I mean, like, you know, if you're going into voting or anything like that, you should be partisan. You should be making decisions in which there are stakes, because there's a lot at stake. And, you know, I would say that when it comes to trying to like a third party situation, you know, like what you laid out before in terms of, it's like, do you try to cleave a new position, or do you kind of like hem towards like what is some of the other parties are, especially in the case of the NDP with the Liberal Party? Do you try to attract yourself towards the center? And, you know, in any movement going forward, what should be the case is that, you know, and what can be learned from the Waffle is having more extra parliamentary action, having more strikes, having more show on the streets, and building more grassroots support, so that if you were to go, you know, establish yourself as more of like a socialist position, it's like you've gone out there and you've won people over, you've corralled them, right?
Exactly.
And that needs to be, you know, moving forward, that needs to be something that is taken into consideration and implemented. Because the problem with these intellectuals or academics, it's like, of course they're going to be necessary, as in everyone is necessary. Yeah. You leave no one behind if they want to be behind something that's like a socialist project. But just because they're academics and just because they're intellectuals, we should have our clear policies that we want, but we should not fall prey to creating these kinds of romantics. Yeah, exactly. Who get caught up in the considerations, because as you get caught up in the consideration, you're not moving your body, you're not going out there to be in support with other people who don't have the time, and they don't have the energy, and they don't have and when I say that they don't have the intellectual capability, I'm not putting intellectualism on a pedestal. It's like they just don't, they think differently. Yeah. It's just a different kind of way. It's like, it's non-abstract. It's like, and you need to be able to build with other people, and, you know, and as well still have, you know, actions towards parliamentary activities, which is important.
Whereas, like, I agree with what you're saying completely, and like what I would say about it is that, like, when it comes to this third party, and like, honestly, I would say that probably the NDP is like is probably a lost vehicle in the sense, like, for this coming election, definitely they're the choice, because there's only a certain number of options available. But like, I'm not sure if it failed with the Waffle and it failed with the NPI, and like Leaf doesn't seem to be taking hold there either. It doesn't seem to be taking hold there either. That, like, there does need to be a party that isn't necessarily looking to win all the seats in Parliament, but to be connecting with movements, connecting with activists, connecting with people who are actually doing things in that direction. And like a certain page can be taken from like the ethos of like what Bernie Sanders talks about, like because like when they always get this question is like, how are you going to deal with Mitch McConnell in the United States? And then you have like all these people say, oh well, I'm gonna try and work with him and cross borders and make bridges and bipartisanship and all this stuff. And then they ask Bernie Sanders the same question. He says, well, I'm gonna go down to Kentucky and I'm gonna get all these people to come to a rally and demand that Mitch McConnell changes something. And he wants to harness the power of people and people's frustrations and people's activism, whereas like as opposed to this like top down electoral politics, we're going to tell you what's best. It's that like to energize the population towards these things,
because that's where the possibility actually comes out, right? Because if you're going to see all these like pundits talking on TV, especially if they're on the right and they're asking, how are you going to do this, how are you going to do that, it's like, well, let's all get together first and let's show how much we are for what we want, and then let's decide that after. But that's still important to be able to decide that. But it's their job to ask these questions to make the viewers seem like, it's overcomplicated. No, these are people who are sitting down, who are thinking, and as they're thinking, they're making that shit more complicated. Look what's going on in Hong Kong right now. There are people who are still on the street 7 weeks in. That's what we need to be doing. And it's like, if you think that Canadian politics isn't as dramatic, it isn't as dramatic, but it could, if you want it to get more dramatic, meaning, that it is worse, that it's shit, then it can, if it was to say to have like an Andrew Scheer Conservative Party. And God knows if it was propped up by the Greens, I mean, that wouldn't make it any better at all. So it's like...
Yeah, and especially when we're living in this sort of parliamentary system where we basically are going back and forth, and we live in a first past the post parliamentary system. So like the NDP, instead of taking the opportunity to gain some level of popular power, it might not be parliamentary power, but they could have had at least a block of people who are ready to make noise behind them, as opposed to being like, no, shut up, you NPI, shut up, you Waffle, shut up. We know what's right. Don't worry.
Well, it's also too. It's like some of these people who are being hired by the NDP. They go door to door, or they they answer phones or whatever. They talk to people to see if they're possible supporters. Fuck that shit. Like as if you're gonna get anyone who's gonna be able to be on board. Just like when you knock on their doors, it should be outside those channels, meaning that like let's get interested in this and just show support. It's like come like September. I mean, everyone should just be like getting out on the streets just with placards like against Andrew Scheer, and we should be having barbecues outside. We should just be like not showing up to work for a week straight. Fuck that shit. We'll figure it out. Let's just do something like that. Let's actually like think outside of it and not consider, what am I going to do about a job, whatever like that. It's like, look, all right, you're going to want to build a society where you can be guaranteed a job and you can make more money.
Or you don't have to make as much money to be able to survive.
Exactly. Imagine like a 30-20 hour work week. If we showed that we wanted a 20-hour work week, it's like in other countries we're able to see us. In the year we're having in terms of rebellion and in terms of strikes, whether it's Extinction Rebellion, whether it's Hong Kong, whether what's going on in Puerto Rico right now, let's take a cue from those examples and treat this stuff seriously. Because if we actually all come together, we can work 25 hours a week, and then we can take watercolor classes, and we can learn how to make a good chicken cordon bleu with all of our time off. Man, come on.
That would be great.
Yeah.
And the thing that's like, one thing that as far as like to address the Waffle Movement's positions a little bit, that I think that are interesting, but we, in a modern context, we kind of have to change a little bit, is the idea, this is all pre-Thatcher, pre-Reagan, right? So like, they're talking about American economic imperialism and the possibility of like Canadian nationalism of the economy and staving off this possibility when like in the end what they feared has happened. So Canada now really is a resource-based and consumer market for the United States. We're a junior partner in global neoliberal economic imperialism. All the things
we are now an imperialist force. It's like so, and let's not think that we're this peacekeeping nation, pure and simple, when that is not the case.
And like these are based on UN human rights reports from Harper days. So like this isn't like even just something that's happened now. We are. But the point being is that like we need to start thinking when they were talking about standing up against American imperialism. Now our job is slightly different. So like to be nationalistic isn't exactly the play anymore because Canada's already part of that. You can't like separate Canada from that now, but to be more of a global stance and being in solidarity with Puerto Rico, with Hong Kong, even though those movements are not monolithic, especially Puerto Rico and Hong Kong. There's like right wing sort of aspects to it, and like it's not in any way just a left movement, but as well with people like Lula and all this kind of stuff around the world. Like we can't be thinking just from a Canadian perspective anymore, because as well with the way that the global economy is set up now, capital flight is real, and Canada needs to be able to, along with hopefully a Labour, Jeremy Corbyn UK, yeah, in and possibly a Bernie Sanders America or Elizabeth Warren America, to start to get away from these traditions. Because it's not that like like fair trade instead of free trade and all these sort of like little like things that you can say.
Yeah, let's get behind the buzzwords and
a little bit,
Yeah, because the thing is and also too, one of the hot button topics for our election right now is oil and gas and like the amount of jobs that would be lost if we didn't have pipelines or anything like that. So instead, you can say this, like, we need to be able to do it. All you got to say is, no, we don't need it anymore. It says, so what, you'd like to get rid of it tomorrow? If it was up to me, I would get rid of it today.
Right, yeah.
And then, at the same time, they say, what about all the people with the jobs working that? I would say, here's the thing. Brad and I will be working beside you, setting up solar panels, if that's the case.
There is work to do.
There is work to do.
There's a jobs shortage, which there isn't, by the way. Like,
no,
employment in this country is amazing right now, but like, there isn't a job shortage. There's a job shortage, not a work shortage.
Yeah,
so
it's like we can truly, from the left, to be able to take away what the Elizabeth May Green Party, we can actually get all hands on deck without sort of a Green Party kind of weird camouflaged fiscal responsibility model. And it's like, if you think Brad and I are going to be anything like these Jim Lax or Mel Watkins guys, it's like, you can listen to us. We stutter a lot. We hem and we haw. Yeah. It's like we're not exactly, we're not the sharpest tools in the shed, but we are the kinds of people that care about this. And you know what? Like, we would actually be working beside a lot of these people who would want to be able to do this kinds of stuff.
And the thing is if we started to get away from ideas like GDP and that the only value is brought on by economic transactions within the country, and that maybe we change our idea of what value is, then our idea of what work is will change as well. So like when somebody's like taking care of a bunch of old people, not just for money, but actually like taking care of people within the society, and we find a way to value that in our society, then maybe we might be able to live like slightly more fulfilling lives, and that like not everything is about how much money you can generate back and forth, but maybe how much you can do for your community, or maybe
you'll be working hard and you'll be playing hard and you'll be having way better conversations with other people too. Yeah. Don't vote for the Conservative Party at all, because here's the thing: Andrew Scheer is already getting his paycheck. Jason Kenney is already getting his paycheck.
Well, he got his paycheck when he endorsed chocolate milk there.
Exactly, right. Yeah, exactly. He's got that dairy lobby money.
He's got that dairy lobby money.
He's been force-feeding his... Also, here's the thing.
He's literally from the teeth.
He's literally force-feeding his son chocolate milk by the tumblerful.
By the tumblerful.
Why he's using the same glass that he probably does with his, like, Appleton's rum or whatever the fuck he drinks. I have no idea why he's doing that, why he said tumbler, but it's just strange that he came up with saying that. But these guys, they already got their paycheck, and they're in the pockets of people that are definitely getting their paycheck. Mm-hmm. So to vote for this kind of party because you think it's going to be able to get like more pipeline construction jobs, let me tell you what, it's like there's going to be plenty of other jobs to be had, and those are jobs to be had from the left. So if you do vote Conservative, all you're doing is that you're cynically voting for the ones with like the deepest pockets already. So don't do it at all. Like, no one should be doing it unless you're a dark force. Legitimately, don't vote for them. Yeah. And vote for the people that are going to be looking out for your whole life and who are prepared to get people to work. Yeah. Starting tomorrow. Yeah. And if you think the party if the party is going to be a little bit hesitant, or that you're skeptical as to whether they can put their money where their mouth is. Here's the thing: extra parliamentary, we have to hold our governments to account.
Absolutely.
If you think that a government left to its own devices is going to disappoint you, of course it's going to disappoint you. What you have to do is, like, instead of watching 6 hours of Netflix, we're going to have to divert some of our routines and spend some time making sure that, say, if it was an NDP government, that they do what we want.
Yeah.
We elect our governments. We should push them to do what we need.
Yeah, like, remember that we live in a democracy. And there's, like, responsibility that is involved in that. Like, we decentralized power, got it away from the kings and queens, then got it away from the emperors, and we got it away from all these guys. And we gave it to ourselves. But the thing is that, like, if you just ignore it, that power is going to go to the people who have money and the new aristocracy, which exists in the form of multinational corporations and people like Jeff Bezos, who have more wealth than comparatively than any emperor or king or lord ever did.
Sure, yeah.
So, like, it's just important that you guys realize that, like, maybe every week you read 5 articles, that just something like that, just to keep informed from different sources, so you can start to understand. Like, it's not that you need to read like super left or super right, but just like maybe some from the National Post, maybe some from the Toronto Star if you're not looking, and then maybe a few more independents like the Tyee and Rabble and stuff. But even if you're like wary of that kind of stuff, just be involved. Find out what's happening in your local news. Instead of watching CNN, watch Global.
Yeah.
Or watch CBC.
Don't be too caught up in Trump.
Because
if you're Canadians, don't be too caught up in Trump.
Yeah.
Yes, it's an issue, but let them figure that out.
Yeah.
We have to figure our own shit out.
Yeah. And, like, Trump matters, but you're going to hear about him anyway.
Yeah.
You don't need to be watching the 24-hour Trump news like CNN or Fox News. Please God, I hope you're not watching Fox News. But still, like, if you ever watch CNN nowadays, it's just Trump. So, like, just watch, and even CBC to a certain extent. So, like, watch Global, or watch, what's the station in Toronto, the C24 or whatever it is.
The one that's on the pizza. Yeah. I think it's the C20. I think it's the C24.
Whatever it is, you Torontonians, you know what it is.
Yeah.
Watch that. Be involved in what's happening in your local area, because it's important.
Yeah, and you know what? Maybe, like I said, I already mentioned 6 hours of Netflix, but here's the thing about something like that, okay? This is a video subscription. Like, if you go home and you watch TV or whatever like that, you watch Netflix, these are companies that are like, that want your money. They want your subscription, so they give you this entertainment so as to keep you sitting there on the couch, just taking in this stuff, not engaging with your social environment. You gotta... And, it's like entertainment is very intoxicating. I know that as well. But it's like we have to disengage from that and, like, start, like, going out into the street and meeting other people who have some of these issues in mind as well. So get yourself educated, but don't just stop at being educated, reading the newspaper, reading these articles. Literally make it a part of your social reality. And the only way you can do that is getting outside your house and being around other people who feel the same way as you do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And to have those, and, like, when you have somebody in front of you that it's not like just a pain in the ass to talk to them, they're, like, clearly too far gone, have the conversation even if it's a bit awkward.
Yeah,
sometimes.
And most people get angry in these kinds of conversations because they're embarrassed or whatever like that, or they don't want to be shown as, it's like having a conversation with someone is a tough thing to do. Yeah. And especially nowadays with, like, how satiated we are with so much images and so much media and everything like that. But you know what? There's nothing wrong with being awkward. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with faltering. There's nothing wrong with, like, getting into these conversations with people. There's nothing wrong with looking like a fool or any of these kinds of things. But you got to get outside, and you're going to seem like a fool at first. But it's necessary to do because you have to make that social connection. I don't want to beat a dead dog.
I was
beating this.
Say,
it's
I feel like we're
repeating.
on the horse.
We're repeating ourselves. Yeah.
So we'll let you go at that.
Yeah.
But it's
we have
it's
nothing
just
else
that,
to say.
To wrap it up, when it comes to this election, obviously the NDP is the choice, especially because of Green's little, like, fanciful road down the conservative
Sneaky.
And then, but going forward after this election, whether it's going to be with the NDP or some other party or movement that comes along, activism is the only way forward. we've got too many things to deal with to just let our parliament do whatever they want to do, or whatever they're being paid to do, or whatever becomes easiest for them to do.
So let's consider, let's just throw it out there, Brad, but let's consider in September, it's like, and let's see how other people respond to this, but an anti-Andrew Scheer strike event for a couple of days in September. We're just putting it out there.
Yeah.
It's already on our minds.
Write in the comments what kind of action you see possible. Anything from a general strike to protest down in the street,
and even anti-liberals too. It's like,
Yeah.
let's not just put Andrew Scheer on
Because
the
the
on
liberals
the
are-
pedestal of milk toast.
The liberals, we don't talk about that much just because it's so hard to talk about them because they're just the most disappointing
Yeah.
possible thing on the planet.
But Andrew Scheer is enraging.
Yeah, Andrew Scheer's enraging. Justin Trudeau's just like a depressed idiot.
Don't get lost in that dichotomy between liberals and conservatives. Think outside of that.
Yeah, seriously, honestly, history can forget the liberals.
Yeah.
The
both
Brits,
of them.
the Brits forgot about the Lib Dems. And now they're just Labour and Conservatives. Let's do the same. Let's just forget the liberals, guys.
Yeah. So September, anti-establishment politics.
Write in the comments.
Yeah.
We'll have a conversation about it.
Yeah, we're gonna keep on talking about it because we only have a few talking points. But see you later.